right, we're going to open it up. Do we have microphone? Katrine, you have a microphone? Okay. Oh, we've got two. Oh, excellent. So if you could introduce yourself when you ask the question, and then ask a brief question, then we can get more questions in. And we had this young man right here.
Hi, my name is Oren Rabinowitz. I'm an SAS major here at American University. Thank you all for coming. My question is, because obviously this situation has been going at such a slow pace, we need to, speed it up with the Syria situation. Can you talk a little bit about how the situation in Syria could potentially impact this whole Iran-Israel bomb, U.S. involvement, everyone else's involvement?
And do you want to, when you ask the question, if you want to direct it at a particular person, do so, and otherwise, if it's just open, then it's open. Okay.
Sure. Let me say something about this. So, we've often heard, I think, that the fall of the Assad regime would be a blow to the Iranian regime. And why is that? Because over the last few decades, Iran has used Syria as sort of a forward operating base in the Middle East to project power in the Levant. By coordinating its supply to Hezbollah, by coordinating its activities in conjunction with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so forth, and that the loss of that would therefore remove that power projection capability from the Iranian regime. I think that's true. I don't think that's incorrect to say that this would be a real blow to the Iranian regime, which has few allies or friends not only in the region but in the world. On the other hand, I think we have to think, how would the Iranian regime compensate? Because if you lay out what are the interests of this regime, how are they pursuing them, I don't think that the mere fall of the Assad regime will cause the Iranian regime to fundamentally recalculate its strategy or its approach towards the world. I think what it may do is, in fact, convince the regime that it needs to compensate for one strategic loss with another strategic gain by moving actually quicker towards having a nuclear weapon, with all apologies to Trita. And I think that, therefore, the way that this comes about is important. I think that one of the reasons I'm not happy to see the West being so passive in the face of what's happening in Syria is, look, I think the message it sends to Iran is that for all of our talk about we'll prevent this or we'll prevent that, in fact, when it comes down to it, we're quite risk-averse, as one might expect us to be, and frankly, as we should be. But if we're not willing to act more forcefully in Syria, then what are the chances we're going to act in response to an Iranian provocation, for example? If in fact, Assad's fall comes about simply because of the chaos inside Syria, I think, in fact, that pushes Iran much more quickly towards a nuclear weapons capability to compensate for that loss. Whereas I think that if it's the West coming together around some kind of solution that leads to Assad's departure, some show of unity and purpose by the West may actually be a deterrent to Iran. And so that's what we, I think, have to keep in mind when we think about Syria vis-a-vis Iran.
Why don't we get some more questions in, Lily? Yeah. I'm going to stay on this side of the room for a minute, and then we'll go to the other side of the room.
Hi, my name's Lily Imami, and I'm an SIS as well. I'm a senior with Oren. Given the fact that we have from now or so until March, this has been reported widely, to really engage with the Iranians, and I'm talking the Obama administration, and re-engage the nuclear discussions that we've been having. What's the likeliness that that will be successful, and what are the next steps following March, when things will be distracted in Iran?
Can I take a grab?
Well, I'd say that we're very likely to see a resumption of diplomacy, and I'd be very surprised if not. And there are many people inside the Obama administration who would like to certainly give it a try, but there are a wide variety of opinions about the likelihood of success. The basic assumption is that there is a grand bargain to be had. What we've heard here as well is that there's sort of this deep concern about weapons capabilities, whether or not it's a bomb, and on the other hand, regime acceptance. That the Iranian regime fundamentally doesn't think the United States accepts this regime in Iran, which the dirty secret is it's true. The fear of a nuclear Iran is not of a nuclear Iran. By the way, that's true in Israel as well. The Israelis, if you ask them about Persians, etc., there's actually not much animosity at all. But there is deep, deep fear of this regime in Iran. That kind of grand bargain, some kind of acceptance for and lifting of sanctions for fundamental verification of a stop to the weapons program, in theory, could be possible. But it is telling, as Michael pointed out, that it hasn't been reached yet, despite the enormous cost that Iran is suffering for not reaching it. You often hear from Iranian officials, we heard at the Saban Center a while ago from an Iranian official speaking about just all these slightly missed opportunities. If just the US had done something slightly differently at different points in time, there would be a grand bargain. And I tend to be skeptical of this simply because of the huge price that Iran is paying more than anyone for the lack of a deal. That said, I think everyone, and this is true of almost everyone in Israel as well, would certainly prefer the diplomacy succeed if it was a deep kind of success to this sort of a deeper solution than merely, some of the percentages here and there.
I think if I could just add one thing to that, I think we should keep our expectations relatively low as to a larger agreement before March. But I think the administration is going to double down on diplomacy and try to see if something intermediary can be achieved before the Iranian New Year in March. And after that, the Iranians are going to have elections. And if you have the same type of fraud and problems they had last time, Iran is going to be paralyzed for much more than just the summer. But within that, I think there is some reasons for optimism to believe that they are in a better position. One, because hopefully the Iranians will have learned a lesson. They missed a huge opportunity in 2009, a huge opportunity. They were so skeptical about Obama. And some of their skepticism, I think they feel, has been vindicated. But nevertheless, they also realize if there isn't some sort of a movement relatively soon, then the opportunity to negotiate may not exist much longer beyond 2013. Then from Obama's side, he's actually in a very good position right now. He's got reelected. There's 2 years left till the next elections in the US, which are the midterms, and I think everyone is happy about that. And this gives him maximum political space to be able to agree or to kind of devise the type of an agreement that at least in the intermediate could work. And the problem is both sides need to reconcile that they will have to make some sort of a compromise. And they will have to bring that compromise home, and they have to defend it to their domestic audiences and to their domestic political establishments. For the United States, one of the things that is toughest is that the Iranians are hurting a lot under the sanctions, and one of their demands to give a concession is that some sanctions need to be lifted. I think the administration is open to that idea. The problem is they're not necessarily in full control of it because many of these sanctions go through Congress, and Congress has not been in a particularly diplomatic mood for the latter part of this decade. Then on the Iranian side, they will have to agree to certain things, and they will have to sell it to their political elite more so than to their populations, because the population doesn't have much of a say in this. And that window of opportunity exists right now until March. If they miss that, I would say that it's going to look very gloomy for all sides. But I think there's going to be a doubling down on diplomacy. You're going to see a P5+1 meeting as early as first week of December. And after that, we'll see if both sides are willing to be a little bit more flexible than they were last time. Last time, they were bargaining extremely hard, and no one got anything. We'll see if they do differently this time.
And I'm going to take one more over here, and then, yes, ma'am. And then if you could. And then we'll go to the other side.
Hi, my name is Janie Jang. I'm a freshman in SIS, and it's amazing to meet the author of a book I'm reading right now, A Single Roll of the Dice. I'm on chapter 2, but I'm working on it. So my question is that...
You want me to help you write your paper?
That'll be great. Question. The question I had was, a brief background was that the NPT that I've been learning in world politics right now allows 5 world powers to legitimately have the nuclear weapons, but others to not. But if looking at putting myself in Iran's shoes, Israel has nuclear weapons, but it's not gaining the same pressure as Iran is having. So how realistic and effective do you think it'll be if we diminish the sanctions on Iran, and instead of trying to have the tensions created by the preemptive strikes to make sure that it doesn't create nuclear weapons, loosen the sanctions, allow them to develop or not develop, and then form a diplomatic relation healthy enough so that there won't be the tensions that we're worried about, like weaponizations or the use of weaponizations. How effective or realistic do you think that approach will be?
Sharon, you want to start?
Well, you've certainly hit the nail on the head in the sense that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't treat all nations fairly, and that there are 5 states that get something different, and then a couple others that have been treated differently, and certainly India and Pakistan have been treated differently. Israel's been treated differently. Iraq ostensibly was invaded in some part because it was supposed to have nuclear weapons, while North Korea's not. So there are all sorts of differences. The NPT was never designed to be fair. It was designed to enshrine a system of power over certain states having nuclear weapons and other states not having nuclear weapons, and that's not going to change anywhere in the near future, which is why I think the word in your question that was most important was diplomacy, that the future for the U.S. and Iran to talk to each other is to actually step back from having talks about nuclear weapons. Because from the Iranian perspective, it's discriminatory and difficult to get progress on the notion that the U.S. says we have our nuclear weapons for security, Israel has them for security, but you aren't allowed. Instead, maybe what we should be doing is talking to Iran about something that's different, talking to them about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about normalizing relations with the U.S. over other things, not with nuclear weapons first, or the nuclear issue first, because that's the hardest thing to talk about in a way that's fair to all the parties that are involved.
Let me comment on this as well. I think that, look, I do think some realism is called for here, in that when you're dealing with an authoritarian state, with a system such as Iran's, one question, this goes back to the previous question, that you have to ask is, can they even really reach the type of decision that you want them to reach? One thing that happened in October 2009 was that it looked like Iran might reach a decision to make a compromise with the United States, and then ultimately couldn't internally make it happen. So I think some people who watch Iran might ask themselves, can Khamenei, the current leader of Iran, really make such a momentous decision? Does he have the authority, or is it within his scope to do so? Or is he so worried about the fragility of the regime that, frankly, even war wouldn't get him to change his mind on this? And so I think we need to look at this from the perspective of what is actually within the realm of the doable for the Iranian regime, and make sure that our policy is calibrated to take that into account. And so it may be, for example, that the best we could hope to achieve here is a long-term delay until there is some kind of change inside Iran, which isn't going to happen as a result of U.S. actions, but may happen, as we saw in June 2009, as a result of something that happens inside Iran. So I take the Soviet Union, for example. We had big problems with the Soviet Union. We managed to talk to them about this and about that, but the fact is that sort of a real accommodation, a real sort of change in the relationship couldn't happen until there was change in the Soviet Union. We have tried to speak with the Iranians about a lot of other things, Iraq, for example, Afghanistan, narcotics. We've had limited success in doing that, but it never has led to this sort of breakthrough. And I would argue that why hasn't that happened? Because the Iranian regime fundamentally doesn't want to see this happen. That the regime is founded on a set of principles from 1979, which include strong anti-Americanism. And these principles, these sort of pillars of the regime, have eroded over time, and one that they're hanging on to sort of preserve the legitimacy of the regime, is resistance to the United States. That is important for their identity. And so to make a normalization with us might be even worse for them than a war with us, if you know what I mean. And so, again, I would encourage you, especially those of you who are students, to start with the question of what are the regime's interests, how does it see the problem, and base your policy recommendations on that, as opposed to sort of assuming that the other side fundamentally looks at the world and its interests in the same way we would if we were in their shoes. Well, that's just not how it works.
Great. All right, that side of the room has been so patient. Right here in the front.
Hello, my name is Omid Nakshina, and I want to say I'm honored to have this group here. I have a question that pertains...
Can you tell us your affiliation?
I'm a freshman in the Washington Mentorship Program.
Great, good.
Yeah. I've got a question that, adheres to everyone in the panel, so I would appreciate multiple input on this. But there's one country in the region that I haven't really heard being talked about much, and that's the Emirates. And I understand, for the most part, people consider the Emirates as nonviolent, fairly small, and unimportant in the region. But there are several factors that I believe should be raised in understanding them. Geographically, they're very close to Iran. They hold no love for Iran, nor do they hold any love for Israel. Their recent conflict over the possession of an island in the Gulf with Iran nearly turned pretty bad. And as most Arab countries, they don't appreciate the Israel-Palestine conflict. I know for a fact that they have a pursuit of nuclear energy as well, which, as Professor Weiner stated, is very close to nuclear weapon status. Then Mr. Singh stated that another factor for that is to have the transportation device, which, as I was at the IDEX exhibition in Abu Dhabi in 2011, I know for a fact that they have the advanced capability to deliver said load. And Dr. Parsi brought up the fact that geographic size no longer matters once you've achieved that level of weaponry, correct? So regardless of their size, when they get to that point, which I believe they will soon because they're being assisted in their program by the South Koreans, I believe it will happen fairly soon, and they have the weaponry. How does that affect the region? I know there's this non-proliferation idea, but if the Emirates gets the bomb, then all the other countries are going to expect to get the same.
Well, if I may, not necessarily specifically on the Emirates, but the Gulfies in general and the Saudi sort of sphere of influence there is a very central element to this equation. The Saudis and their allies, and Qatar as well, are important players in this game. And the fear of proliferation, and especially of a Saudi or other response to an Iranian nuclear bomb, if and when, is also a central element to the U.S. Stance. So we mentioned the diplomacy. I think we sometimes underestimate the concern of the Obama administration about the proliferation question. So there's some debate about whether the president is serious about, the way he stated it was unequivocal, never let Iran get a bomb under his watch. And from the Israeli perspective, this has been central to their calculation. Because let's be honest, if they really truly believed that the President of the United States would never let Iran get the bomb, we wouldn't hear the threats of an Israeli unilateral strike. They would much prefer the U.S. do it. The lack of trust between the leaders, and I'm not saying the blame is necessarily here, but the lack of trust between the leaders has been significant in this respect. From the American perspective, this question of proliferation in the Gulf and elsewhere is central to the thinking. And we shouldn't underestimate, I think, the resolve of this administration to prevent nuclear weapons. Again, nuclear weapons, not necessarily nuclear capabilities. And the core of it is not Israel. It's not even Saudi or the Emirates or anyone else there. It's actually about proliferation. And we are seeing a crisis of the NPT regime. We're seeing a crisis of this question of proliferation. It's bigger than the Middle East, and it is very important. The NPT regime, which is not new, really allows states to arrive basically at the doorstep of nuclear weapons capability without breaking the rules. And that's not even without exercising their right to withdraw from it. And of course, we have states who are not members of the NPT at all, like India, Pakistan, and Israel.
Anybody else want to respond to that before we go to gentlemen here toward the end? Okay, sir.
My name is Ron Thompson. I guess I'm an independent scholar. I have a question for both Trina and Sharon about something neither of you said, and that's the very consistent and highly inflammatory rhetoric that Iran is engaged in about what it would like to see happen to Israel. And in particular, Sharon, when you mentioned Iran following the path of other nations that acquired nuclear weapons, not one of them was ever doing it on the basis of calling for the annihilation of another state. Your comment.
Let me just suggest that to say that Iran has made these claims, I think I would say instead that there are domestic political factions in Iran that make these claims that are using it for domestic political purposes. I mean, obviously it's concerning, right, to have a state that calls for the annihilation of another state, even if it's just for domestic political purposes with a nuclear weapon. But one of the standard explanations for nuclear weapons is that states want them for security. And so from the Iranian perspective, how do you address Iran's concerns with its security in the neighborhood in the absence of nuclear weapons if Israel's allowed to have those nuclear weapons, right? So we've seen this. Let me back up. The issue for me isn't so much the rhetoric, which is terrible, right? To call for the annihilation of Israel. The issue is, how do you enable states to satisfy security issues when they get caught up in domestic politics, when they get caught up in their relationships with each other, and both can't be satisfied as secure at the same time? So that's the academic answer.
I think that's a very important question. The rhetoric coming out of Iran since 1979 against Israel has been venomous at best, and oftentimes much, much worse. For understandable reasons, particularly, I would say, the comments that Ahmadinejad has made about the Holocaust, which actually took it one step further compared to what Khomeini used to be saying. I have not found any, I think one or two statements that Khomeini made about the Holocaust, but this Holocaust theorizing of Ahmadinejad is a pretty recent phenomenon in really trying to deliberately escalate the rhetoric. And I think I would guess that there's absolutely no understanding whatsoever on the Iranian side what that does to the psyche of the average Israeli who statistically probably had several people die in the Holocaust. I don't think there is a recognition of that. There isn't a recognition of how these issues are being perceived on the other side. At the same time, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that the rhetoric of the Iranian state and its actions, according to the Israelis themselves, have oftentimes been separated because the Israelis know very well that a lot of the rhetoric is not necessarily reflective of policy, and a lot of the rhetoric is used either for domestic, but in this specific case, I would say mostly regional consumption, in which the Iranians are trying to rally Arab support for their position against Israel, which is something that they've been doing extensively since 1979. In fact, throughout the 1980s, when Iran began for the first time using this type of venomous rhetoric against Israel, because of the importance of the geopolitical constellation at the time, in which Iran and Israel still viewed each other as having common threats and common geopolitical imperatives, collaboration between the Israelis and this regime under Khomeini was taking place quite extensively throughout the 1980s, escalating, of course, in the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986. An Israeli initiative, not only to sell the Iranians arms, but also to bring Iran back into the Western fold, because the Israeli calculation at the time was that if Iran loses the war and Saddam Hussein wins, that would be a tremendously disastrous situation for Israel. And here the US and Israeli perspective tended to diverge because the US was moving closer to Saddam, whereas the Israelis were continuing to sell arms to the Iranians and provide them with spare parts for their American weaponry. But also, in case this enmity between the US and Iran continued and Khomeini died, there was a concern on the Israeli side that Iran would be sucked into the Soviet sphere. And that was the winning argument in Washington. I mean, during the Cold War, anything you wanted to get done, you had to bring in the Soviet Union into the argument, and pretty easily you can get the US on its side. But it's a fascinating story, because you see that in spite of that very high-level rhetoric, there was a very different read of it and a very different behavioral pattern than what you see today. That is not to say in any way, shape, or form that the rhetoric isn't important or that it should be ignored. Neither Israeli or Iranian rhetoric should be ignored. But to also realize that there's a completely different show behind the scenes, below the surface, underneath the rhetoric. That is very important to understand. In fact, there was a very interesting meeting a couple of months ago, earlier this year, organized by an American university. It's off the record, so I have to be a little bit careful of what I'm permitted to say, but there were Iranian officials there, as well as Israelis. They didn't talk to each other as much as they yelled and screamed at each other, but it was a dialogue of sort. But it was very interesting to see, theoretically, how you actually saw that there were some potential openings, and both sides were trying to test each other and see what are the things that they could and could not agree to. What are the ways in which they'll never be friends under this regime, at least, but there are ways that they could avoid the disasters. And I want to emphasize, unfortunately, I can't go into the details of what was being said because of the Chatham House rules. It was a very different conversation than what you see on TV. The rhetoric has its own little life, and it has its own audience. But what you saw when decision makers were talking to each other was quite different.
I want to get another student in. Are you a student? Please. I didn't want to insult you.
Oh, no, it's all right. Hi, I'm Steve Sullivan. I'm a junior with SIS. Forgive me for oversimplifying a very complex situation with my question, but at least as far as I can tell, overanalyzing is not exactly lacking in this area. Given the fact that I think everybody here can agree on the fact that we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, keyword being weapons, and we can also agree that that's the inevitable outcome from something as severe as a military strike. What do you feel would be the best recourse or in imposing something different, given the fact that a lot of, as you said, the Iranian people are not necessarily the ones calling for this, it's the leadership, and some of the other actions that are taking place by the leadership, specifically last week's reporting of firing at a US drone, doesn't exactly give off the impression of dialogue and communication, whether it be rhetoric with its own life or something more mundane and civilized. What do you think is an alternative for trying to make both sides happy, even temporarily?
Well, look, I think that a lot of this comes down to the question of what will the Iranian regime at the end of the day really accept? This is the big unknown here. I think that the P5+1 has made a real effort to kind of put out proposal after proposal to say, if what you want is a path out of this, if what you want is a face-saving exit from this confrontation, if what you want is a nuclear energy program, here are different ways to accomplish it, and that hasn't succeeded. So what I imagine is going to take place over the next several months is yet another effort at this, with perhaps an even more generous offer. I would argue that a more generous offer at this point is actually counterproductive, but I think that's what will actually take place here. While at the same time you see an increasing of sanctions. So you're increasing the cost to Iran while trying to increase the benefit to Iran of stepping back from this confrontation. I think that the U.S. officials and P5+1 officials more broadly are at pains to say that, look, this is in the best interests of the Iranian people. If you want economic development, if you want all these things, here is the way out of it. We're ready to cooperate. But it's the decisions of the Iranian regime whether or not to take that path or whether to take a path that leads to what is ultimately going to be a confrontation. Because President Obama, I think, has been quite clear, to his credit on this point, that he's not going to accept an Iranian nuclear weapon. He's going to, if necessary, use military force to prevent one. I think that's, at this point, the right strategy, and I think that's what we'll see.
I'd like to make just a point on this, that there's a real dilemma here from a policy perspective in the United States, because the Iranian regime's fear of the United States that secretly really what they'd like is that the regime disappear is true. And the dilemma from the United States perspective is that really that is what the US and most other countries would prefer. They would prefer the Iranian people have democracy, that if can happen in Cairo, it would happen in Tehran. Not necessarily that a democratic Iran wouldn't pursue a nuclear program, not necessarily it would be pro-American, certainly not that it would have the relations that the Shah had with Israel, but the whole scheme of things would be very different if it wasn't for this regime in Tehran. Certainly from the Israeli perspective, there are many who remember Iran well from the time there were relations, many. There are many who were born there, including the head of the opposition for another couple of months. He won't be after that. And former president. There are many who remember Iran well and like and have very warm feelings towards it, towards Iranians, etc. That's not the issue. The question earlier about the rhetoric, and it's not a rhetoric just of some domestic, actor. It happens to be the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. True, not the most important person in the country, but ostensibly the second most important. And he is the president. Now, he may just be saying it for domestic consumption, but as should have said, and I agree completely. Well, I agree, and I would add something. You cannot be more offensive to the average Israeli. There is nothing to say that would be more offensive. And more importantly, it's not just the Holocaust denial. It is the outright threats towards Israel. And you can like Israel, you cannot like Israel. That's sort of beside the point. Israel is a country with a population, and it's a member of the United Nations. And so a country that is pursuing nuclear weapons, threatening, at least its president, threatening some kind of something terrible towards it, however you want to interpret it, is bound to raise alarm. Now, I'm not saying this as an anti-Iranian statement. I'm saying this is why it seems that the Israelis are so obsessed with this Iranian question and won't let anyone deal with anything else. Saying this to say that in the coming months and after diplomacy succeeds or fails, etc., the Israelis are not going to forget about this. Most definitely not this prime minister. And this is cause for concern for all of us. But we come back to the same basic dilemma. Does the West want to have a grand bargain in which it basically accepts this regime in favor and in return gets a verifiable stop to nuclear weapons capabilities? Or does it try and delay? Does it try and pull the regime along, basically play the same game that they are playing, hoping that the Iranian people bring down the regime? Those are really the only two options that the US fundamentally sees: a grand bargain or internal regime change. And I'm not suggesting it's an easy choice. I don't think any administration here in Washington has really figured it out, not the Bush administration, not the Obama administration, but that's the fundamental thing we're talking about. Do we wait for regime change from within, or do we make a grand bargain with the regime?
I had a couple of things. I think actually the contour of some sort of a deal, and I don't think at all it will be a grand bargain. I don't think there is any interest on the US end to become cozy and have a love affair with this regime in any way, shape, or form. There isn't that desire or that political willingness any way, shape, or form. And at the same time, I don't think from the Iranian side there is a desire for a partnership with the United States. This regime does not want to be seen as being a partner of the United States because within the region, it views that to be a delegitimizing factor. And for its constituency throughout the Arab world, that's probably true. But there can be a new equilibrium, one in which this enmity takes on a different form, but it is not in such a shape that it will actually risk bringing the entire region into a war that would be disastrous for everyone. They can take a couple of steps back from the abyss. And the contours of that deal, I don't think is a mystery to anyone. I think it's quite clear what it would be by and large. It would be that there would be enrichment in Iran, but only below 5% under the strictest forms of inspections. Iran would have to accept additional protocol. It would hopefully also agree to limiting the enrichment to only one site. It would not stockpile LEU and the material that you can build for a bomb. In return, there would be an acceptance on the American side that there is going to be enrichment on Iranian soil below 5%. There would be a lifting of sanctions, at least the latest round of sanctions. Many of the other sanctions that the US have had for more than 2 decades precede this phase of the nuclear confrontation. And I think this is actually quite doable. It's not that it's difficult to envision what the solution would be. It's the political path that both sides need to take to be able to get to that state. Not terribly different, perhaps, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which the contours of some sort of arrangement is understood. The difficulty is to find a path there. I have some hope for the next round of negotiations because I think what has been missing from previous round of negotiation is that sense that, okay, this is really getting to a climax. I think the Iranians need to be in that sense in order to be willing to make concessions. But also because there hasn't been any sanctions relief on the table up until now. In the last round of talks during the summer, there was no serious offer of sanctions relief. There was only an offer to revamp plane air parts, etc., which I think is very important. But the Iranians are not going to give up a strategic asset for something like that. I think the idea that you negotiate by guessing what the other side wants, you go there, you try your guess. If it doesn't work, you draw the conclusion that the other side is not interested in a deal, is not how you make business. In order to negotiate in a new world in which the United States is not in an overwhelmingly superior position to be able to enforce its will on everyone else, you have to figure out what is it the other side actually is interested in. And if you want to get a deal, you have to make sure that you get what you want while you're also willing to put on the table something that is attractive to the other side. I think in the negotiation round so far, neither side has actually done that. They've instead taken on very, very hard positions and tried to essentially stare down the other side. And neither side is going to be able to be stared down. There's going to have to be a compromise. And that's extremely, extremely tough politically to sell.
All right, we're coming back over here. Yes, in the purple tie there.
Hi, my name's Eric Barrows. I'm a senior in the foreign policy program here. And I was just curious how much weight you're giving to Israeli elections for the the future of this issue, given that opposition figures have accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of excessive, belligerent stances. And so is this just political rhetoric, or if we see a party like Kadima find some success in the upcoming elections, could we see a serious shift in Israeli positions?
I'll jump in on that if I may. In theory, elections could be extremely consequential. If, say, Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, announces this week that he's running, which he may, he'll probably announce one way or the other very soon, and won, that is not likely, then we would see a very different thinking. Again, an answer at the very, very beginning, don't mistake any of the Israeli officials, even those who are very much opposed to Netanyahu and the belligerent stance of Netanyahu and Barak, for being doves on Iran. Olmert is not a dove on Iran, and he just believes in very different means. The New York Times reported widespread covert attempts to stall the Iranian program, both cyber warfare and others, and many of these reportedly were under the Olmert government. The reason you haven't heard the word elections so far yet is I'm very skeptical that any of the opposition leaders, including Olmert, could actually beat Netanyahu in these elections. It's not an overwhelming, it's not going to be a landslide in any sense, but the blocs are very stable. The right-wing bloc that supports Netanyahu more or less has been very stable since the beginning of his term, all the way back 4 years ago. Around 65, 67, the worst poll, 63, of 120 members. And as long as that magic number of 60 is now broken by the center-left, we're very likely going to see a Netanyahu government. There was some speculation that Olmert, if he ran, could pull away Lieberman, the foreign minister, maybe a Sephardic religious party called Shas, maybe could do all sorts of things. I'm very skeptical of these possibilities. The electorate of these parties is very right-wing. They want Netanyahu as prime minister. So unless the center-left can get 60 or 61, Netanyahu is the next prime minister. But I would just say one last thing, which is the government is going to be very different. Ehud Barak is probably not going to be defense minister. His party is going to be, he has a new party, which might not even make it in, and if it does, it'll be very small. In theory, he could be defense minister even as a civilian, but it's unlikely. Kadima is not going to be, if Olmert doesn't run, and even if he does, we don't know, it probably won't be the biggest opposition party. Labor is likely going to be the biggest party. There's a new center party by someone named Yair Lapid, who's a famous journalist, that will probably be the largest center party. So we're in a very different array of actors, including in cabinet, and this will have interesting, I think, effects on the calculus inside. Barak being out of there, although he was former prime minister from Labor, actually might strengthen the doves in some respects, but Lieberman's position actually may, well, it depends on the day. Lieberman sometimes is a dove, sometimes a hawk. So many things have changed, Michael.
You know, I just want to add to what Natan said, which I think is exactly right. I think that at this point it looks like Netanyahu probably is in a position to win, and his coalition after victory is much more likely to be a more right-wing coalition, not including some of the centrist parties that are in it now. And I think one of the key considerations, one of the key things is, you know, how does President Obama and how does Prime Minister Netanyahu, how do they react to their victories? You know, because in a sense, both may interpret their victories as a mandate for their way of doing things. And of course, their way of approaching this problem is different. And so they both can't be right, in a sense. So they could both be right, but it doesn't help you get to a more cooperative approach. So the question is, do they look back at the past 4 years and say, you know what, this didn't work very well, and we need a new approach, which is to be a little bit more cooperative, keep our disputes behind closed doors, work things out by picking up the phone rather than holding press conferences and so forth? Or do they say, look, this just confirms that my position is right, and I'm going to continue doing what I was doing? I don't know which approach they'll take. I think we'll find out as the weeks go by here. But I would hope it's the first, that they find a way going forward to work more constructively together. Because the thing is, of course, the U.S. and Israeli positions are really not very far apart on this issue, and yet our two leaders have had a very hard time working together. You know, I wrote back in 2009, shortly after both of them came to power, that, you know, they have a lot of opportunities here to work together. And frankly, I would write the same thing now on both this issue, on Syria, but also on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which Trita compared this to, which is the ultimate vote of pessimism, I think, to compare anything to the Israeli-Palestinian issue as saying it's not going to be solved. But actually, the truth is, on all these issues, they, I think, see more eye to eye than you'd think from their interactions with one another, and they need to find a way to work together.
Can I add one point there? I agree that the personal chemistry between Netanyahu and Obama has been significant complicating factor for the collaboration between Israel and the United States on this issue. But I think there's one more factor as well, and I agree 100%, Nathan, that in substance there's not that much of a difference between the different Israeli candidates. But there is one issue that I think should not be forgotten in all of this. I mentioned earlier on that how difficult it is for Obama to sell a compromise at home and for the Iranians to sell a compromise at home. The same thing is going to be for Israel. And by now, I think Netanyahu may be in the most, or at the least maneuverable position compared to some of the other candidates, in the sense that he has by now come to personify the argument that it's 1938, Iran is Germany, and Ahmadinejad is Hitler. This is something that he's been using over and over again for the last couple of years, the theme that Iran is an existential threat. Well, if you made that argument and you made it as persuasively as you've done, you've come to be identified with the argument, how do you take a step back from that position and say, well, by now we're going to accept 3.5% enrichment in Iran? His ability to do so, I think, is less. Now, he's a very skillful politician. Perhaps he can play his cards very efficiently. But if you take a look at someone like Barak, and I agree with you, I'm not saying that he's going to be the next prime minister, or even someone like Livni and others, they've kept certain rhetorical openings in what they have been saying. Barak in particular, since 1993, has been consistent in saying Iran is not an existential threat. Iran is a major threat, but it would be an insult to Israel to say that Iran could be an existential threat. Same thing that Ephraim Halevi is saying. Livni was the one who is believed to have released an internal Israeli document a couple of years ago, leaked it, in which it came out that internally the Israeli government does not view Iran as an existential threat. So they kept certain openings in which if there has to be an agreement and a compromise, they have an easier time maneuvering that than the person who's identified with the argument that is 1938 in Iran is Germany.
And I would just, if I may, one last word. There's a debate about whether Netanyahu is serious with he's saying it only to push or not. I should say that in Israel, most people think that not only, I agree completely with Rita, not only does Netanyahu have less maneuverability on this, but he actually believes this. Like he's been writing about Iran for many years, and he's been talking about this threat for a long, long time. And it may very well be that he sees this as a generational challenge that he will face, that he is the one to deliver Israel against all opposition. And so in that sense, he's personally is different than others, including people to his right, including Lieberman or Bogi Ya'alon, people to his right. They would be quite different on this issue. And in fact, Bogi Ya'alon, who may be the next defense minister, in fact, has been very different inside the cabinet on the question of whether or not to strike unilaterally than Netanyahu or even Barak, who is a bit more complex.
Sharon, I wanted to step back for a minute and think about other states that have either had nuclear weapons or had nuclear weapons programs and decided, in fact, to take a different path. We've seen a country like Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons. We've seen other countries that were on the path to developing weapons that abandoned programs, countries like South Africa or Brazil. Is there a lesson from any of those countries that have abandoned a path or have given up these weapons that would be relevant as we think about Iran? Or even Israel, for that matter, since you were the one that called for the nuclear-free zone earlier in the evening.
There are lessons for all of these countries, but unfortunately they're not big lessons. So the case of the former Soviet states, they gave up their nuclear weapons because it wasn't realistic for them to maintain nuclear weapons programs in the infrastructure. They were paid to give them up. They were happy to give them up. They wanted normalized relations with the rest of the world. So the United States isn't quite making the same offer to Iran. Other places like South Africa, South Korea, Brazil, Argentina, they gave up their nuclear weapons because the rationale for them in the first place was never significant. There was never a strong security argument for all of those places that persisted over time, and that's certainly not the case with Israel or Iran. The issue for me with Iran is I think we have to stop treating it as if it's a case of proliferation that might happen, that someday they might have a nuclear weapons program. Iran inherited its first centrifuges from Pakistan. It learned to reproduce them, it learned to repair them, it learned to put them into cascades, it learned to repair the cascades when the US sent in various different ways of making those cascades fall apart. It owns the technology from scratch to enrich uranium and to a level that's necessary to make nuclear weapons. Now after that, it's not trivial to weaponize that, to put the weapon on the top of their not very accurate missiles. But we have to start now treating Iran as if it is in effect, that it can't go back from that knowledge. That knowledge is its forever. And that was never the case for the former Soviet states and for certainly Brazil and Argentina. So it's a different case by itself.
Great. And the guy in the green had a question, and then we'll come back up to you.
Hi, I'm Stu Huffman. I'm a graduate alumni of SIS. I'm currently a PMF at the State Department. My question is about our current sanctions policy and whether on the ground in Iran there is some sort of schism between what the people believe the effects and the rationale for it are and what the government and the regime's belief about the effects, given that during the recent spate of hyperinflation, most of the people seem to be chanting against Ahmadinejad, and he's being called in front of the parliament to answer the questions for it, and that given that the actual stated reason for the sanctions regime is to deny Iran crude oil income to fund their project, but that the actual government has responded by threatening to cut off oil exports altogether, and they've recently introduced legislation to cut it by at least a third as retaliation for the sanctions. What do you consider the rationale for that, and the difference between the views of the people and the regime?
Take this. It's been very interesting to see that as these sanctions have had quite a devastating effect on the Iranian economy, the messaging from inside the government, depending on where in the government it's coming from, has been very different. Many of the conservatives have sought to put all of the blame on the Ahmadinejad government, and he frankly does deserve a lot of the blame because he's been pursuing economic policies that have been so disastrous, so that it's really made the effectiveness of the sanctions all the greater. And it's, I think, to a certain extent motivated by the fact that inside Iran's political system, former presidents continue to be quite important. And you see that with Rafsanjani, with Khatami. Of course, their influence goes up and down, but they're still political personalities. And I think there is such an animosity towards Ahmadinejad, particularly from some of the conservative elements, particularly the Larijani brothers who hold the parliament, the Speaker of the Parliament, and the Minister of Justice, and there's more of them. They, I think, just want to finish off Ahmadinejad to make sure that there's no post-president life of Ahmadinejad in the political system in Iran. And it's easier then, when they have created that space, it's easier for the population to go out and protest. They're really protesting against the government as a whole, but you know, it's politically feasible to just charge your slogans against Ahmadinejad, because then you won't get into trouble. But if you start saying something about Khamenei, you'll actually end up in trouble. So, you know, you go out and protest, and you make a rhetorical compromise, and you just focus on Ahmadinejad. So we've seen some interesting things, but there's a lot of this is domestic politics, so we don't know exactly how the regime as a whole will deal with this post the elections, assuming that they'll have a little bit more of a cohesive government and less of the infighting that has been quite unprecedented for the last 4 years, mindful of the fact that most of the infighting is within the conservatives, not between conservatives and reformists and everyone else who's now been essentially excluded from the political spectrum. But the impact on the population, this is something I think we should be very, very careful about, and I'm not seeing enough of a recognition of this. The impact of the population is far greater than the impact on the regime itself. These are blind, indiscriminate sanctions. When you prevent a country from being able to sell oil, and oil is its main income, you can't say that these are targeted sanctions that are hitting the regime. They're hitting everyone, but mainly everyone but the regime. And you can see that in particular right now because of the financial sanctions that are making it impossible to even buy goods that are not sanctioned. So for instance, we have exemptions, humanitarian exemptions for medicine, but it's increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for the Iranians to buy it because there's no banks that are willing to handle this. And then our assumption or calculation is that the population dislikes the government so much, which is true, that they will direct that anger against the government and not against the United States. I think we have to have a more nuanced picture of the Iranian population. They're capable of disliking two entities at the same time. They're quite capable of doing that. And I think this anger, and which is actually increasing quite rapidly, is going to be directed at both sides, particularly mindful of the fact that the medicine is not getting in. That's quite different from the past. In the past, it was sometimes difficult for the population to be able to figure out, is this economic misery because of the corruption of the regime, because of its incompetence, because of its mismanagement of economy, or is it because of the sanctions? When it comes to the medicine, and that people at hospitals are dying of very simple things because they're not getting that medicine, it's very easy to know it's because of the sanctions. Now, had sanctions relief been on the table in the last rounds of negotiations, I think you would have seen a greater balance of anger towards the regime because they rejected a deal that the population found to be attractive. That was, however, not the case. We made it very clear that in at least that round of negotiations, that first phase, we would not be lifting any of the sanctions that have been hitting the Iranian economy very hard. Speaking to people in northern Iran who absolutely hate this regime, who incidentally are hit the hardest by the sanctions because the government has managed to make sure that the sanctions hit the upper class and the middle class more than it hits the poor elements of the society. You could hear people over there saying, we wouldn't have accepted this deal either because there's no sanctions relief on the table. Again, this is part of the reason why the next round of talks are going to be very interesting. If we mismanage this, and we're too much in love with our sanctions than to actually use them as the leverage that they're supposed to be, we already know what the blueprint of this is, because this is not new territory. We had this situation with Iraq. We had the situation in which sanctions decimated the middle class, destroyed the fabric of the society, killed up to about 375,000 women and children according to UN estimates, and we did not see the fall of Saddam Hussein. We did not see the changes in his policies. So we can't make the argument that, well, it's the first time we didn't know that this would happen. We know quite well what will happen with these type of sanctions if they're on there for a long period of time and we don't utilize them as the pressure that they're supposed to be, which is to say, this is hurting you a lot. If you change your policy, we're willing to lift them.
I think what we'll do is we'll gather several questions because we're about 10 minutes away from closing down. I'm sure you guys must be somewhat tired. So let's gather a couple questions, you first, and then we'll take a couple in the back over there.
Hi, my name's Andrea Meyerhoff. I used to be the Pentagon's Director of Medical WMD Defense, and now I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. My interest in this subject is mostly as it guides practical decision-making based on my own prior experiences. And I can think of reasons why I would like to ask each one of you this question, but I'll defer to the panel and you can answer it as you wish. What impresses me about tonight's discussion is the number of times we've raised the matter of nations in this region, or perhaps in this time in history, that have an interest in implying they have nuclear weapons, whether or not they actually do. And my question at this point when I look at this is, what do we understand of either our intelligence communities or our policymakers for how much they take this into account when they're looking at this problem? Clearly, if we understand that bluff plays a serious role here, what role does drawing lines have? Similarly, if we understand that we're never going to get satellite shots or seismic data or something that tells us clearly there's been a test weapon, how do we operate in this environment, and what are our decision makers doing to take that into account? I have to admit to the tiniest bit of frustration every time I hear, well, they could be doing it just to impress their neighbors. So I'll stop there and just ask any of you to answer that for me.
Great, and then we've got gentleman there and then the person behind him. Go ahead.
My name is Sagtam Saha, and I'm a sophomore in SIS. And my question is, there was a report this morning that Israel, a leaked report that they are planning, or rather, they analyzed that a conventional airstrike would not be able to penetrate deep enough to destroy a key Iranian nuclear facility, so they have a plan in place to use nuclear strikes. Whether or not that's just posturing or that's an actual plan or a mixture of both, how do you think that changes the rhetoric of this current conversation, and how it would change Iran's plans currently?
Right. And then the last one.
Yes, hi, my name is Rashad Abelson. I'm a first-year law student here at American. And my question is, how realistic is it that sanctions will be softened on Iran, considering they continue to fund and influence more direct and immediate threats to Israel, such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and continue to subvert governments in the region that are friendly to us, like Bahrain and Iraq? Yeah.
So we'll start at the far end and work our way down. You can pick whichever question you'd like to answer, and we'll keep it brief with each of the four panelists.
Okay, briefly, sanctions. They're hurting lots of things in Iran, but they're not hurting their nuclear if they have a nuclear weapons program. They're not hurting that program. They don't need anything from the outside to make centrifuges. They have their own natural uranium. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about what the goal of sanctions is and what they're actually doing. If the argument is that suddenly the Iranians are going to wake up and say, oh, ouch, okay, we give in, we don't want nuclear weapons, I wouldn't wait around so much for that. So keep in mind it's not actually doing anything to delay the nuclear weapons program. The notion that Israel would bomb Natanz or, I got to be careful, I always want to call it the Fordo facility, which then leads to all sorts of issues about the magic ring. The issue isn't necessarily that they can't, that these facilities are buried deeply underground. It's not that Israel can't get there. It's that once you get there, you can't, with any reliability, destroy the facility. And even if you destroyed the infrastructure that went to the facility, and this, by the way, is true also for the United States, you're delaying it by a matter of, in some cases, months, in some cases, a few years. You're not destroying it permanently. So that goes back to my argument that we need to start dealing with the notion of Iran in a different capacity as a state that possesses the knowledge to do this if it chooses to do so, and then to treat this as a political question with that knowledge.
I guess for the question in front, you asked about countries bluffing about their nuclear capabilities. In a sense, I think the worry about Iran is the opposite, that Iran, has been at pains to deny that they are seeking nuclear weapons when, in fact, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that is, in fact, the aim that they have. And I think that in a sense, what we see is the reverse of the Iraq scenario, where because of Iraq, U.S. policymakers are very cautious. And, of course, the world is very skeptical about claims about nuclear programs. And so what we see is almost the reverse dynamic, where Iran is claiming it doesn't have it. We see plenty of evidence, but, of course, there's a natural skepticism that bars people from kind of putting two and two together, if you know what I mean. Look, I think that at the end of the day, any deal, and I think Trita mentioned this, is going to require Iran to sort of prove itself innocent. It's going to require intrusive inspections. It's probably going to require transparency about the past and so forth. But I don't think the problem we have with Iran is that Iran wants us to believe it's more capable than they are. In fact, most of what I could tell you about the Iranian nuclear program is documented by inspectors who are just physically reporting on what they see. Everything else beyond that about leadership intentions and so forth is by necessity speculative, but that's the nature of this type of work. So I don't think that's the problem in this case. I think there's a different problem in this case, which is how can we really be sure that they've crossed some sort of threshold which is we can't let them cross? Well, what is that threshold, and how do we know when they've crossed it? That's the hard question here, because nobody wants to precipitously go to war if we don't have to. Everybody wants to sort of give diplomacy and sanctions every effort that we possibly can. Which brings me to the question of sanctions, and I think that we have to be realistic about sanctions. Sanctions, look, there's a body of academic study about sanctions. They're not terribly effective at achieving large goals vis-a-vis autocratic regimes. They're much more effective when their goals are modest and when you're dealing with other democracies, which are by their nature subject to the kind of, much more the cost-benefit of what's in the national interest, as opposed to what's in the interest of just a few people or a few elites. And that gets to some of the difficulty with the sanctions. And we're all, in a sense, I always worry when people get too fixated on a tactic or a tool as opposed to a strategy that makes sense comprehensively and coherently. Because sanctions really are just a tactic. And what we see with these sanctions is I think that, look, I think they were the right sanctions to put in place, and I do think that sanctions is an important component of a good Iran policy. But if you look at the sanctions that we have in place, I think it's right that, look, they don't directly prevent the regime from paying for a nuclear program. They've already got what they need pretty much in place, and it's more of a matter of political will. And so you're trying to affect their political will. And the problem is that elites tend to be much more shielded from the effect of sanctions like this than the ordinary person is. And that's I think, the difficulty you grapple with whenever you have these sanctions. So you've got to have other parts to your policy as well. And it's got to all fit together to make a comprehensive whole. And my question about Iran policy has always been, not just now, but in the past, is it coherent? Do we have the right components together to make a comprehensive whole? I think in the past we've been too reluctant to join negotiations. Now I think we're too fixated on just this one tool and hoping that it'll deliver the goods for us. And I think the last young man who asked the question back there has really hit the nail on the head when it comes to the question of a grand bargain or a sort of last best offer, which is that even though we're all talking about the nuclear program, that's not our only concern with the Iranians. And in fact, if you look at the sanctions, they're not all nuclear sanctions. There's quite a few human rights sanctions, quite a few terrorism sanctions in place. And having lived through the Libya deal as a policymaker, I'm aware that you have to resolve a lot of issues before you can truly normalize. And so I think the question is, I think that what Trita said is correct, that the Iranian regime is sort of waiting for that sanctions relief offer. The problem, though, is from the United States perspective, are we going to tie that to just one sort of modest goal of ours? Are we going to give up all these sanctions? Or are we going to wait for something bigger, which frankly may never come because of the way the regime views its interests? And that's the real conundrum here. I mean, and if I had a simple solution for it, I would have already given that to President Obama and he would have already done it. But I don't have a simple solution for it.
Just quickly on the question about the report on the use of tactical nuclear weapons, it's pretty new, and I'm not, I'm pretty sure it came from a flippant remark to the contrary by a former chief of staff, who was also former chief of the Air Force, Dan Khalutzi, was here in D.C. recently. And he was saying, contra Netanyahu, that the Air Force cannot take out some of these things unless he did something crazy like use tactical nuclear weapons, which I hope he would never do. So it was raised flippantly in opposition to Netanyahu. So I would not lend much credence to the suggestion that Israel would use tactical nuclear weapons to take out the facilities. About the bluffing, again, this is a bit of a twist of it, but I do think it's hard to sort of find theoretical interest in such a morbid topic, but it is almost a pristine case of games of chicken going in three different directions. And the question of trust, I alluded to earlier, is very central. Many in Israel think, for example, that at least Barak was playing just a huge game of chicken, and that Israel's put all this money and effort into building the capabilities to reach Iran, which is not trivial at all for Israel and has been in the works for a decade at least. All this to get the world to do it. And some of the people look at it say, you're yelling at Netanyahu for being so belligerent and but you know what's happening? P5 plus 1, that's 5, that includes China, it includes Russia, plus 1. They're all serious about this now. So it worked. And none of them would care. We're the only ones who would really care. We and the Saudis, but the Saudis won't say anything. And so that kind of perception of people who favor Netanyahu actually saying he's not serious about attacking, but look, he's actually the only one who's getting everyone, including Obama, who many Israelis don't like, etc., to do all this kind of thing. But of course we don't necessarily know, and that's by design. By design, we do not know if he's bluffing or not, or the bluff was terrible. Barak, in fact, has implied that was sort of what he was playing all along, and that might be the case. It's hard to tell with Barak. Netanyahu, I'm more skeptical that it's a bluff, but it may be. Barak is too smart for anyone's capability. He really is. But it's also true on the U.S.-Iranian question. There are these bluffs and double bluffs, and we don't know. And as I alluded to earlier, if the same trust between Obama and Netanyahu existed as between other presidents and prime ministers, Israel may be much quieter. Olmert and Bush, for example, had a much closer relationship. And so, though I agree, I don't think the personal animosity, the fact that they're very different matters in the grand scheme of things, but in this particular case, it actually does. If Netanyahu believed that when the president says there will be no Iranian nuclear bomb, if he believed that, Israel might behave quite differently. And unfortunately, I don't think he does. In fact, I'm quite convinced he doesn't. And everyone I speak to who knows him well say he does not. This should worry all of us, regardless of what we think of Netanyahu.
Quickly.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I just want to add, keep also in mind, Netanyahu had a pretty bad relationship with Clinton. So we may be seeing a pattern.
So you're saying it's a Democrat's fault.
I wasn't saying anything about that, Michael. I thought these comments were very good. So I'm just going to add two comments. One about the red lines, etc. Obviously, red lines have been important, and it is a tool that can be used, but one has to be extremely careful about it as well. I think one of the things that Israel has done, and Natan may be right in the sense that it does definitely have increased the international alarm about this issue, and I'm pretty convinced that this alarm would not have existed had it not been for some of the things that Israel has done. But it also come at a significant expense. Much of Israel's defense is based on the credibility of its deterrence. And Israel has put forward numerous red lines that the Iranians have walked through without any significant consequence or at least any action from Israel's side. It's been everything from, you can't put gas into the centrifuges, you absolutely cannot started centrifuges, that would be a point of no return. I mean, there's always been these really nice catchphrases. 2 years ago was point of no return. Now it's zone of immunity. I'll promise you there's going to be a new phrase next spring. It's going to be really, really catchy, but it's going to be the same issue over and over again. And ultimately, this does erode Israel's credibility. And in fact, if you take a look at what Iran has done just in the last 6 months, as was evidenced from the last IAEA report, it seemed almost as if they deliberately were making sure that they were not moving closer to the US's red line, but that they were actually moving much closer to the Israeli red line to exacerbate the problems and the tensions that existed between the United States and Israel. The Iranians do not seem to fear an Israeli attack. We have not seen any indication of that at all. So with them, the threat or the bluff does not seem to be particularly effective. On the issue of using nuclear weapons, I'm very glad that you explained. I never heard about this. I hadn't missed that story. But I can say, had it been true, I can guarantee you, threatening to use nuclear weapons is certainly not the way to convince another country to decide, let's not go for a nuclear weapon.
Well, it's just left for me to say a few thank yous. First of all, I never get a chance to get this educated, so I'm really grateful to Professor Atzili for inviting me to block out 2 hours of my time to learn something. I really need to make it more of a practice, so I appreciate that. I'm very grateful to Celeste Wallander, the director of the International Politics Program, for co-sponsoring this, and grateful to Laura Cutler, director of the Center for Israel Studies, for co-sponsoring this. Grateful to all of you for coming, and I'm always thankful that we have such smart students, so I appreciate you all asking such good questions. To the three of you who came from off campus, thank you for coming off campus to be here. And to Sharon, we're always grateful that you are on the faculty here at SIS. So thank you all very much.